Whether you're a longtime fan of the band or you're discovering them for the very first time, I invite you to settle in and join me for a uniquely intimate journey. We're going to step beyond the music charts and big crowds, beyond those nostalgic 1960s images, and move into the hidden pockets of Richard Manuel's story. We'll see how he grew up in the small-town shadows of Canada, shaped by local clubs and youthful hopes. We'll witness the breakthrough that came when he joined forces with a rough-hewn group of musicians who would, against all odds, define an era of Americana-infused rock. And we'll navigate that lonely terrain after the spotlights dimmed, when stardom cracked under the pressures of addiction, anxiety, and regrets. It's a history that may leave you with more questions than answers, but it's also a reminder of music's irrepressible transformative power and of the fragile souls who bring it into being. So let's begin by setting the stage. It's the late 1950s in southwestern Ontario, Canada. This slice of time is crucial because the rock and roll culture of the United States is drifting across the border, capturing hearts and fueling the ambitions of countless small-town kids. Elvis is shaking up the airwaves, Jerry Lee Lewis is hammering the piano like a man possessed, and Ray Charles is blending gospel and blues in a way that knocks people to their knees. Up in Stratford, Ontario, a young Richard Manuel is soaking in all of this with an almost reverent awe. He's just a teenager, but the music has woven itself into his daily life. He's playing piano at 9 years old, singing in local churches, jamming in school halls, and feeling a spark that tells him there's something bigger out there, something he might latch onto. Stratford is a modest town, best known for its Shakespearean theater scene. It's not typically the place you'd assume would spawn a major rock musician, but that's the paradox of art. Sometimes the greatest creativity emerges from unexpected corners, born of a longing to escape the everyday. For Richard, playing the piano was more than a pastime. It was a window into an entire universe of emotion. Local stories say that even as a kid, he had an uncanny ability to make the piano talk. But it was his voice that could turn heads. Neighbors, teachers, and fellow students described an almost otherworldly quality, raw and bluesy yet tender, like the echo of a spiritual lament that was centuries old. He practiced night and day, sometimes ignoring other obligations. It was as though the music was beckoning him to fill a bigger role, and he was determined to answer that call. Before long, Richard found himself in local bands, the most notable early endeavor being the Revels. This teenage group was a stepping stone, a chance for local kids to play the hits of the day, often imitating their American idols. But even then, Richard stood out for that booming, soulful cry in his throat. The Revels occasionally opened for Ronnie Hawkins, a flamboyant Arkansas rockabilly singer known for grooming young Canadian talent. That's how the future lineup of the band began to coalesce around Ronnie Hawkins' orbit, especially the group that would later be called the Hawks, and eventually simply the band. Ronnie Hawkins was a wily showman. Big sideburns, big laughter, bigger stage presence. He had an almost paternal role with young Canadian musicians, offering them a crash course in show business, how to hustle, how to play for rowdy crowds, how to handle the long nights on the road. This environment was a perfect training ground for Richard. The Hawks at various points included Robbie Robertson, Levon Helm, Garth Hudson, and Rick Danko. These musicians were refining their craft on the traveling bar circuit, playing clubs throughout Canada and parts of the American South. Imagine the smoky bars, the sticky floors, the din of conversation that drowned out every subtle note, unless you had a lead singer powerful enough to make people stop talking. Richard soon became one of those crucial voices that could hush the rowdiest crowd. In set after set, night after night, he belted out rockabilly tunes and R&B standards, wrestling them into a new shape altogether. By the early 1960s, the Hawks were forging a distinct identity, blending rock, R&B, country, and pure gut-wrenching soul. Each member was a multi-instrumentalist and a character in their own right, but it was Richard who delivered that intangible heartbreak in every performance. Robbie Robertson later recalled how the first time he heard Richard sing, he thought, "That man had the direct line to the deepest places of the human spirit." As if that voice wasn't enough, Richard was also a formidable pianist, one who drew from blues, gospel, and even classical ideas he picked up along the way. Their big break came when Bob Dylan, the iconic folk singer who wanted to go electric, recruited them. In 1965, Dylan was in the middle of a cultural firestorm. He was turning up the amplifiers, to the fury of folk purists who viewed electric guitars as heresy. Yet Dylan, never one to compromise his muse, decided to enlist the Hawks as his backing band on a series of controversial tours. The audience response was often hostile. At times they booed, they jeered, they called Dylan a sellout. But the Hawks soldiered on, launching a new era of rock music. Dylan described them as the best band in the land, especially praising Manuel's ability to deliver the kind of emotional resonance Dylan's newly minted rock songs demanded. Now it's important to remember that the Hawks were still relatively unknown then. They were these mostly Canadian kids thrown into a worldwide spotlight that was swirling around Dylan like a raging storm. Richard, who was used to a smaller circuit, found himself on stages in Europe, hearing the bizarre spectacle of half the crowd booing while the other half screamed in ecstasy. It was an intense environment, yet it somehow bonded the group. Traveling on those tours became a rite of passage, forging inside jokes, personal tension, and a sense of camaraderie that only occurs when you face the world's confusion head-on together. When the Dylan tours wound down, the group retreated to a big pink house in West Saugerties, New York. This secluded hideaway, famously known as Big Pink, was where they jammed, wrote songs, and recorded what would become known as the basement tapes with Dylan. This pivot proved crucial because it allowed the Hawks to evolve from a backing band into their own creative force, rebranding themselves simply as the band. In 1968, they released Music from Big Pink, a groundbreaking album that introduced an earthy, raw, and uniquely American sound. Ironic given that most members were Canadian. Critics lauded Richard Manuel's voice in songs like Tears of Rage and In a Station. It was around this time that Bob Dylan allegedly told friends that Richard's vocals were some of the purest expressions of sorrow and yearning that he'd ever encountered. It didn't matter if you were hearing the words in the best or worst of times. You felt them punch through your chest. The band's eponymous second album, often called the Brown Album, showcased an even deeper sense of roots, melding Appalachian imagery, Southern rock grooves, and old-fashioned storytelling in tracks like The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. While many fans might credit Levon Helm's Arkansas twang for giving the music its Southern flavor, it was Richard's smoky, raw testimony that lent the songs their sense of wounded holiness. When Richard sang, you felt generations of heartbreak unspool in real time. One of the earliest lesser-known turning points for Richard personally came during the sessions for the band's third album, Stage Fright, 1970. According to accounts from fellow group members and technicians, Richard was struggling with anxiety and a creeping sense of self-doubt. He was grappling with the question of how to sustain creative momentum. The music industry had changed drastically since the freewheeling days of touring with Ronnie Hawkins. Now there were contracts, producers, label expectations, and public scrutiny. Richard began leaning more heavily on alcohol, perhaps in part to quell the swirling insecurities. There's a quiet heartbreak in reading diaries and snippets from that period, which some band historians have dug up. They reveal Richard sometimes writing lines like, "Don't know if I can keep this going," and "The songs get heavier every day." The weight of success was manifesting in the form of late-night binge drinking and occasional drug use. Still, on stage the group remained electric. Richard's stage presence, his short, stocky frame hunched over the piano, that intense expression, and the sudden clarity of his vocals remained mesmerizing. Audiences had no clue about the inner battles. If anything, the pain might have deepened his performance. The band pressed on, releasing Cahoots in 1971 and continuing to tour. Yet the seeds of tension were sprouting. Robbie Robertson emerged as the dominant songwriter, to the consternation of other members who also contributed heavily to arrangements, but felt overshadowed in the distribution of credits. Richard wasn't the type to fight for the limelight. He had a gentle demeanor, at least off stage, preferring to let others deal with the business side. This passivity only worsened any internal sense of being undervalued, a sentiment that Levon Helm would later famously recount in his memoir, This Wheel's on Fire. The group dynamic was tricky. 5 supremely talented musicians, each with distinct personalities and unspoken resentments, trying to balance the creative synergy that once came effortlessly. By the mid-1970s, that synergy was running thin. Robbie Robertson was eager to move on, tired of the grueling tours and perhaps wary of the toll the rock and roll lifestyle was taking on his bandmates. The big farewell came in 1976 with The Last Waltz, a lavish concert at San Francisco's Winterland Ballroom directed by Martin Scorsese. It was a massive event featuring star-studded performances by Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Muddy Waters, and many more. Millions have seen the resulting film, where Richard Manuel can be spotted behind the piano or stepping up to the microphone for his signature raspy soul. In one of the film's more tender moments, he offers a fragile vocal take on I Shall Be Released, and you can almost see the weight of the entire journey etched across his face. What's less commonly discussed is how The Last Waltz, while hailed as a triumphant send-off, left Richard feeling adrift. After more than a decade of near-constant performing and recording, the group's cessation signified a major identity crisis for him. He was in his early 30s but had spent most of his adult life in the band. If that was over, what came next? The sadness he felt became more pronounced. Rumors circulated that he resented Robbie Robertson for calling the shots and orchestrating the farewell. It's impossible to pin blame on any single person, because Robbie had legitimate concerns about their future, while Richard's own struggles with substance abuse and mental health were overshadowing creative possibilities. But from an emotional standpoint, The Last Waltz was far from the neat, celebratory curtain call it appeared to be on film. Over the next few years, Richard tried to carve out a solo path. He recorded a few demos and performed on various projects. However, nothing quite took off. The band minus Robbie Robertson would sporadically reunite for one-off gigs in the early 1980s, largely because there was still a demand from fans. They loved seeing the chemistry of Levon Helm, Rick Danko, Garth Hudson, and Richard Manuel, even if the old magic had become a faint echo. At certain shows, Richard's voice wasn't what it used to be. Heavy drinking and emotional stress had taken a toll. In 1973, there had even been a severe vocal strain that forced him to rest his throat. He lost some of that upper range purity that defined his earlier years, but the grit and soul, that never left him. If anything, his timbre deepened into something even more sorrowful, as if each phrase emerged from a bottomless pit of longing. Those close to him recall that he oscillated between periods of relative stability, days or weeks when he would seem jovial, joke around with fans, and express excitement about the future, and days of paralyzing darkness, locked behind closed doors, with a bottle and a torrent of negative thoughts. Friends and bandmates tried to help. They urged him to seek therapy, or to ease up on the booze, or to find a sense of purpose beyond the old 1960s dream. But it wasn't that simple. Depression, especially in a culture that often glamorized excess, was poorly understood and rarely addressed directly. Struggles were either hidden or brushed off with a "he'll bounce back" optimism. By the mid-1980s, it seemed that Richard was making some progress, at least outwardly. He was performing again with a reconfigured version of the band, including some new sidemen filling the gap Robbie had left. Crowds still greeted Richard with open arms. In one rare taped interview from 1985, he seemed almost hopeful, describing how the music is still in me and how he wanted to keep writing and find ways to share it. There's a particular moment in that interview that breaks your heart. He's asked about the substance abuse rumors. He fidgets and deflects, saying, "Robbie, well, I like a good time. I'm trying to keep it under control." You can see he's torn between wanting to reassure fans and acknowledging a problem he can't quite escape. Then came the night of March 4th, 1986, in Winter Park, Florida. The band, minus Robbie, had just finished a spirited performance at a local club called the Cheek to Cheek Lounge. The show was sold out, the audience was cheering, and by all external appearances, things seemed promising. Afterward, the group returned to their hotel. There was some casual socializing, a few drinks. Nothing appeared amiss. But in the early morning hours, Richard Manuel slipped away to his room, alone. Later that night, bandmate Garth Hudson and others discovered he had taken his own life by hanging. He was just 42 years old. The shockwaves were immediate and profound. How could someone who had just performed for a packed crowd, someone who still radiated that spiritual authenticity on stage, choose to end it all just hours later? No note was left, and so the tormenting question of why still lingers for those who loved him and for fans who only glimpsed him from the other side of the footlights. Some suspect he felt a crushing guilt for not living up to a certain standard he'd set for himself. Others believe it was depression combined with years of substance abuse. In a sorrowful reflection years later, Levon Helm said, "We all tried to help him out of that hole, but sometimes the hole is bigger than all of us." Where controversies arise is in the possible what-ifs. Some fans and historians question whether more could have been done to intervene. Did the music industry itself chew him up and spit him out? Or was it a personal chain reaction that no one could fully halt? Then there's the matter of the Last Waltz. Many argue that Richard was overshadowed in the official narrative, that his emotional struggles were swept under the rug in a film designed to celebrate the group's achievements. Others delve into the complex web of songwriting credits and financial disputes with Robbie Robertson, suspecting that money problems further contributed to Richard's sense of despair. Robbie, for his part, expressed deep sadness over Richard's death, stating that losing him was like losing a part of the band's essence. Yet the debate persists among fans about whether Robbie's role in the group's dynamic contributed to the isolation Richard may have felt. Despite the lingering questions, it's impossible to ignore the cultural significance that Richard Manuel's voice and presence continue to hold. The band's music has never fallen out of rotation. Younger generations discover it through iconic tracks like The Weight, Up on Cripple Creek, and The Shape I'm In. But they also gravitate toward the rawer, more emotional tunes, particularly the ones Richard led. And in each of those recordings you can hear that trembling heart that made him so special. He sang with a vulnerability that rock music at the time rarely displayed. Decades later, artists ranging from Elvis Costello to Bruce Springsteen have remarked on the impact of the band, singling out Richard's vocals as a guiding star in how to convey honesty in a performance. Interestingly, there are also stories from lesser-known local gigs, anecdotes that point to a side of Richard rarely discussed. One recollection from the late 1970s has him playing an impromptu show at a tiny club in Texas. After finishing the main set, he allegedly stepped off stage, mingled with fans, then sat down at a rundown upright piano near the bar. For nearly an hour, he quietly sang old gospel tunes, oblivious to the passing time. A small cluster of people stood around, transfixed by the purity of his voice. One attendee later wrote in a letter to a friend that it felt like a private confessional, as though Richard was letting his guard down in a way a big concert would never allow. These informal after-hours vignettes paint a portrait of a musician who lived and breathed through his art, especially in intimate moments that rarely made headlines. When reflecting on his legacy, you might consider the question, why does Richard Manuel's story matter today, especially to a new generation that knows the band as part of rock's dusty pantheon of legends? Part of the reason is that it exemplifies both the dream and the nightmare of fame. Here was a small-town kid with an extraordinary gift who found global recognition. Yet the recognition alone wasn't enough to silence his internal demons. His life underscores a truth about the human condition that resonates far beyond the realm of music. Sometimes our greatest strengths, our empathy, emotional range, and capacity to feel deeply can become the seeds of our greatest vulnerabilities. Furthermore, Richard's vocal style and piano work remain deeply influential. If you listen closely to the wave of Americana and roots rock acts that rose in the 80s and 90s, from John Hyatt to the Black Crowes, you'll catch echoes of the band's DNA. That seamless blend of gospel fervor, country twang, and rock grit owes a lot to the synergy Richard and his bandmates forged. Modern artists looking to ground their music in authenticity often cite the band as a touchstone. And while Robbie Robertson's guitar and Levon Helm's drumming are usually the first references, many of those same musicians will eventually circle around to say, but that voice, Richard Manuel's voice, was the soul. This voice wasn't just a sonic phenomenon. It was a testament to the raw emotion that can be conjured when an artist is willing, perhaps compelled, to bear their brokenness. It's easy to romanticize such brokenness as a creative muse, but we should remember that for Richard, it was also a source of immense suffering. His life story invites us to question how we support the creative souls among us, especially those who wrestle with mental health concerns. This story also confronts the glossy narratives that sometimes define rock icons, reminding us that behind every gold record or sold-out show, there's a human being grappling with fear, longing, and the fragility of self-worth. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.